So the title of my message is called The Famine, and it comes from the book of Amos. The passage that we're going to go over today is Amos chapter 8, verses 11 through 14. So if we go ahead and jump right in and turn to Amos chapter 8, verses 11 through 14. So I can go and read this, Amos chapter 8, verses 11 through 14. Okay, thank you. So this passage, it describes a famine, and it provides very beautiful or elaborate imagery on what is happening here. And it talks about a famine for bread or a thirst for water. And you see here that people are staggering from sea to sea. And it makes clear that what the famine is a famine of hearing the words from God. And you see that these people are struggling and they're starving for the word of God. And they go here and there, they seek it in one place and they seek it in another place, but it says they will not find it. And in verse 13, it specifically calls out, "In that day the beautiful virgins and the young men will faint from thirst." So it also talks specifically about young people. It talks about how young people will faint from thirst. And it's talking about thirst for the word of God. And I think this passage is interesting, and it's important for us today because I think there is a famine for the word of God in the world today. There's a famine even among ourselves or in our environments. I think there's a famine for the word of God. And I guess if you look at it from one perspective, there's a lot of access to preachings and messages. If you go on YouTube, you can hear various messages at any time of day. You can just search and get as many messages as you want to hear. You could potentially nonstop listen to messages. There's several ministers or famous preachers that you can listen to whenever you want to. So from one perspective, you may view that and think, how can there be a famine? How can there be a lack of the Word of God? Because people can access it anywhere, and there's so much that they can get So I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why there is a famine for the Word of God today. 3 things that are causing a famine in the world today among Christianity and among Christians. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is the people who are dispersing the message. There's an issue with that. There's an issue with the preachers who are sharing the message of God. And we see that in the scriptures that sometimes that can happen. If we look at Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 8 through 9, it says, "How can you say we are wise and the law of the Lord is with us? But behold, the lying pen of the scribes has made it into a lie. The wise men are put to shame. They are dismayed and caught. Behold, they have rejected the word of the Lord. And what kind of wisdom do they have?" So this passage is talking about scribes. And what scribes were back in that time is they were the learned people. They were the people who would write down the scriptures. They would write down, or they would copy the scriptures. But what this is saying is that the scribes themselves are diluting the scriptures. They're changing the scriptures. And what ends up happening is that they are rejecting the word of the Lord. Yet at the same time, these people, what this is indicating is that they're claiming to be wise. So these are the wise among them. These are the academics among them. These are the learned among them. But they're manipulating the Word of God and turning it into a lie and rejecting the real Word of God. And we see that in the world today. We see academics who take the Scriptures and they dilute it, they manipulate it, they change it to fit the world, what the world believes today. They fit it to the message of the world. They fit it to the message of what the devil wants us to believe. And so we have to be very careful as Christians that we don't just defer to supposed academics or intelligent people, or even to people who learn from academics. We have to be careful that we come to the true Word of God, because this world has an agenda. This world has an agenda to follow after the things of this world, to promote the things of this world, and they'll take the Scriptures and they'll change them in order to be consistent with the message of the world. So we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of just deferring to academics or supposedly wise people. Moving on, we see in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 through 4, it says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths." Now here it says that they want to have their ears tickled, which is a kind of a strange way to talk about it, but it's kind of funny. I don't know what image you get in your head, but it's almost like, I don't know. I don't know exactly what imagery that would convey, but it's kind of, it has kind of a awkward tint to it, or a kind of funny, humorous tint to it. But they wanted to, basically, they wanted to hear certain things. The audience wanted to hear certain things. And in order to hear those certain things, they surround themselves with teachers who will give them those things. They don't want teachers who will tell them the truth. They don't want teachers who will say something that'll make them convicted or feel badly about the way they're living. They want teachers who will tell them exactly what they want to hear. And that was something that was occurring back then, and I think that's something that still occurs today. Instead of sound doctrine, instead of wanting what's consistent with the Scriptures, people surround themselves with teachers who will tell them what they want to hear. And what happens if it's someone who tells them the true Word of God? What they'll end up doing is they won't invite them anymore. They won't listen to them anymore. They won't attend those types of meetings. And so then what happens then is the person who gets promoted, if the people aren't right, what happens is the people who get promoted, the people who get invitations to speak, end up being the people who don't tell you the truth that you need to hear. And so we have to be careful of this, that we don't surround ourselves with teachers or preachers who don't teach us sound doctrine. And so one of the key reasons why we see a famine in the world today is the twisting of the Word of God. And it either comes from the academic circles, or it comes from having preachers who won't preach the Word of God, or they'll preach the Word of God, but they'll twist it in a way to make it consistent with the message of this world. And so we have to be careful that we don't succumb to that. So we talked about the preachers. The next issue that comes up is the hearers. We as hearers of the Word of God have to make sure we're in the right place. And so in 1 Corinthians 3, 2 through 3, it talks about this. It says, Paul says, "I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you were not yet able to receive it. Indeed, even now you are not yet able, for you are still fleshly. For since there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly, and are you not walking like mere men?" Here you have Paul speaking to these people, Paul, the greatest apostle, but the issue isn't Paul, the issue is the receivers of the word. And the people who Paul is speaking to are fleshly. They act just like this world. There's jealousy and strife among them. So what does Paul have to do? He can't teach them the truth, the intricate word of God. He has to go back and teach them the basics. He has to give them milk, what he's calling, instead of solid food. Basically, they're acting like babies, so he has to give them baby food. So it's important for us as Christians, as hearers of the word, to make sure that we mature. We shouldn't be in this rut of just being led by jealousy or led by strife. We must advance and progress as Christians and not end up in a place where whoever's speaking to us has to lower the message to our level so that we never learn or progress or mature because we still need to get back to the basics. So that's on us. As hearers of the word, we need to be people who are maturing and are moving and allow the preachers to speak to us. That's something that will allow us to advance. And then you have the parable that Jesus talked about, the parable of the sower, where Jesus talked about how someone would sow seed, but based off of the ground on which it landed, it wasn't able to flourish. And y'all know the story pretty well. So I wasn't going to go into details about it. But you had different people who were receiving the word. And some of them, when they received the word, wouldn't pay attention. Some of them would be overwhelmed by the persecution around them. They had no solid footing. And then they would end up losing it whenever persecution came. Other people were choked by wealth or the worries of this world. And so we need to ask ourselves, what kind of people are we? Are we allowing the word to hit us? Are we allowing it to impact us? So the question we should ask ourselves is, what are we doing when the word of God is being preached? What are we doing during Sunday school? These are very simple, practical questions. Think about what you did today between 9 and 10. Were you doing something that was worth more than getting a Christian education? Were you doing something that was worth more than learning from the Word of God? And if it wasn't, you should ask yourselves, why didn't I prioritize the Word of God versus these things? During the messages at church, are you in here listening to the Word? Are you like this good ground? Or are you on the outside chatting it up or having a snack? My kids have a problem with that as well. As soon as I get into church, they suddenly become very hungry. They say they want to eat something. So I compromise a little bit. But it's important for us to be focused and prioritize the Word of God. Because sometimes we're creating this famine for ourselves. We need the Word of God in order to be strong Christians. And a lot of us are weak, a lot of us are struggling because we're not eating that food. Or when we eat the food, we're not eating the pure Word of God. Instead of we're eating an adulterated version of the Word of God. And so the second point that I wanted to make is that, it said that the connection is lost. I don't know if y'all can, oh wait, I'm going to hit play. Okay, got it. Okay, so the second point is that we must not be flawed hearers of the Word. We must give importance to the Word of God. Now, the last point is the preacher can preach the right thing, the hearers can hear well, but then ultimately we have to put it into practice. And Jesus talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount when he talked about the wise man built his house upon the rock, and the foolish man builds his house upon the sand. And sometimes we sing that song, and as kids, we sing that song, and we forget about what Jesus' meaning was for that parable. The meaning that Jesus says is the person who builds their house on the rock is someone who hears the word of God and does it, or hears these words that Jesus preached and does it. But the person who is on sinking sand, the foolish man, hears the word, but doesn't put it into practice. And so if we want to be wise as Christians, we need to hear the word of God and then put it into practice. If we hear the word of God and don't put it into practice, we will become foolish. We will begin to struggle. Our house that we built will begin to fall because it's not on solid ground. So the main point of my message is to emphasize the importance of the Word of God. Because I think we are living in a famine that today, a famine for the Word of God that doesn't does not only exist outside of the church, but even within the church. And the reason it exists in the church is because sometimes we hear messages, but the messages are lowered to our level. Or the messages twist the scriptures to be consistent with what the world teaches. But we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of lowering the word of God to fit our sinfulness. We have to be careful that we listen to the word of God. We have to be hearers of the word of God and give importance to it. And not just give importance to other things. Because it's the one time where we're actually, if you think about it, when we're singing, we're the ones singing. When we're praying, we're the ones praying. But when the word of God is being preached, the idea is we have the word of God, God speaking to us. So if we give importance to everything else but the word of God, then almost what we're saying is what we have to say is more important than what God has to say. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. We must give importance to the word of God, and we must fight against this famine that exists. Because if we allow it to continue, we will continue to grow weaker and weaker, and the church will grow weaker and weaker. But we must allow the word to flourish within us. We must allow the word to sustain us and give us sustenance so that we might grow stronger and stronger and no longer be like little babies, but mature as Christians and be a strong church that fights for the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you.